additional announcements that not prayer requests, but they're announcements that I wanted to remind you of. On our calendar that we've not finalized yet for the year, you'll see that this Sunday is what we have titled Sunday Sing. We originally intended that this would be for the afternoon service, and since we've not yet started our afternoon services yet, we're thinking about that. We're maybe a couple of weeks away, a week or two away. We're going to see how this new strain of COVID reacts in the state. But since we're not starting that yet, I think we're going to go have our Sunday Sing. So we're going to have the ladies do a special, we're going to have the guys do a special, and we're going to have a couple of other specials, but we're going to fold those into our morning service. So what I'm saying is eat your oatmeal and make sure you have some peanut butter or some crackers if you need them, because we might go a little bit longer than you're used to. I won't hold you that long. I'll be respectful of your time with the sermon. We'll have a little extra music, okay? Everybody's good with that. I'm seeing mostly smiles, except for one guy's asleep on me already. So I also wanted to say happy birthday to Corbin. We missed his birthday yesterday, but I remembered it. And somebody has a birthday coming up on Saturday. I won't mention Miss Virgie's name. Well, yeah, Miss Virgie has a birthday on Saturday, so y'all be sure to wish her a happy birthday this week. Daniel, chapter number 1. This is our second, I said chapter 2, I meant chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, this is our second lesson. We introduced it last week. Babylon coming to power. This is Daniel's test of loyalty. If you're looking for a title, Daniel's test of loyalty, let's just read Daniel chapter number 1, and we'll make some comments. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and unto Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Daniel said to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. We gave you some historical background last week when we introduced this book to you. And I want to remind you of some of that this week, but give you a little more detail of the historical background. And when Babylon was coming to power, you must remember that this continues back to the time when we read in Genesis of the Tower of Babel, and when the Lord defeated the nations, or he separated the nations at the Tower of Babel, and he brought them confusion of tongues. Part of that was used by God to prevent any one nation in the world from becoming a supreme ruler over any of the other nations. And that continued for quite some time, that continued for many centuries. And then in the course of time, man began to learn other languages, and he began to conquer other nations. And here we see, from reading Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophecy that we recently studied in Habakkuk, that in 722 BC, the 10 northern tribes of Israel were taken captive by the nation of Assyria. And the king at the time was named Sargon. And then in 606 BC, 115 years later, we see the two southern tribes. The nation of Judah is taken captive by the Babylonian king, and his name is Nebuchadnezzar. And actually, he's a co-regent with his father at the time. And this is this happens in a series of 3 sieges of Jerusalem that we mentioned last week. And this first siege begins a 70-year captivity period, and it's predicted actually by Jeremiah. And we're going to read some of these references. If keep your place there in Daniel, and go back with me to Jeremiah chapter 25, and you'll see that a number of years prior to this carrying away of the captives into Babylon, Jeremiah not only prophesies that it will happen, he gives us the very nation that will perform these duties. Jeremiah 25, verse 11, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. In 606, Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, began to march north, and he was trying to conquer many lands. He was trying to march up into Syria, and what he happens to do is he marches north, and this king of Egypt marches against Babylon, and he's overwhelmingly defeated in a battle that we know as Carchemish, and this happens at the west bank of the Euphrates River. Also predicted by Jeremiah. If you happen to be taking notes, you can write down Jeremiah chapter 46. Jeremiah 46 gives us the details of the battle in prophecy, by the way. Nebuchadnezzar then drives Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, all the way back into Egypt, and he conquers the nation of Egypt. And on his return trip to Babylon, he comes to Judah. And this makes Babylon then the first world empire. And while returning to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar marches against Jerusalem. This happens in 606 BC. It is, as Daniel says, the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim. Of course, the city is quickly taken. Jehoiakim is taken and put in fetters, and he is arrested, if you will. Many of the nobles, many of the king's children are arrested and carried away into Babylon. But what happens at that period is Nebuchadnezzar hears about the death of his father. And this is another man who you're familiar with if you've studied history. And I know some of you are history buffs, so I'm going to throw this out there for you. Nebuchadnezzar's father is also a great military general who has helped raise Babylon to a world empire. This is another general that you've heard of. His name is Nabonidus. The death of his father, Nabonidus, has now caused him to see the need that he has to return to Babylon so that he can secure the empire, so that he can secure all of the power for himself. And so what he does now is he's away on this campaign in Judah, and so he releases Jehoiakim and restores him to the throne on the promise that Jehoiakim, as a conquered king, will pay tribute to Babylon. And so what he does is he carries all of these nobles and he carries away these this ruling class. He carries away these favored class, and he leaves Jehoiakim as a puppet king, if you will, to pay tribute, to pay taxes to Babylon with just the working class to work the land and to raise this money. And so Judah is put under tribute. He takes many of the temple vessels. He takes a lot of the furniture and the riches out of the temple, and he plunders that. And he takes all of this back with these favored young people, young men. That's where we read about Ashpenaz, who is the ruler of the Babylonian eunuchs. The king brings back these young men who are wise, they're well-favored, they're supposed to be in the line to become rulers in Judah, but yet they find themselves as students and slaves in Babylon. And the king appoints this man in verse 3 named Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to find who are of the king's seed and who is of the princes, to bring them back to Babylon and teach them the ways of the Chaldeans. And so Ashpenaz, as the ruler of the eunuchs here, was ordered to select those princes, and they had to be of royal blood. They had to be of the ruling class. They had to be of the wise young men of Babylon, or of Judah, to be brought to Babylon and taught the ways of the Chaldeans. And of course, this is another name for Babylon. Shinar is another name for Babylon. You'll see these names used somewhat interchangeably. And the point here is they're bringing them back. They're going to give them a 3-year training period where essentially they're brainwashed. And what they're doing is they're taking the young men that should be ruling in Judah, and they're bringing them to Babylon and teaching them the ways of the Babylonian kings. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. But what happens in the homeland is also important. Judah rebels. Of course, we talked about that briefly last week. Jehoiakim, this puppet king, begins to figure out what's going on in this new empire. And so he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar after 3 years. Babylon then sent their neighbors to make war against Judah and to crush the rebellion. Again, we can read the history of this in the book of 2 Kings. I'll turn there and read it. You don't have to, but you can join me if you like at 2 Kings chapter 24. Just a couple of verses from 2 Kings chapter number 24. The Bible records this history for us. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servants the prophets. Surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah, to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. And so while Jehoiakim rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and the king of Babylon then sends the neighboring nations to invade Judah, to again put this puppet king under tribute, what does the Bible say? The Bible says this king in Babylon was the puppet king acting under the word of the Lord, doesn't it? He says the Lord did it because the Lord was judging the nation of Judah. Why? For their sins, for they shed innocent blood in the city of Jerusalem. And so I just bring that to your attention because, as we've said so many times before, man makes his plans, the king issues his decrees, but the Lord has his way. Man rules, but God overrules, doesn't he? After 5 years of war, after 5 years of this conflict in the city of Jerusalem, Jehoiakim dies, and his son, whom you read in the prophets and in the book of the Chronicles and Kings as Jehoiachin, is installed as the new king. This lasts for 3 months. After 3 months, Nebuchadnezzar then comes personally to besiege the city the second time. That's 598 BC. And this time, King Jehoiachin and all of the princes and all of the mighty men and an additional 10,000 of their citizens are taken to Babylon, along with all the craftsmen, along with all the smiths that are taken and carried away and put into tribute in the nation of Babylon. You see, they wouldn't serve in Judah and pay taxes, and so he carried them away as slaves and put them into service in Babylon. And by that action, he leaves only the very poor of the land, the destitute, the deprived. That's all that's left. Before leaving Judah this time, Nebuchadnezzar makes Jehoiachin's uncle the king. You see, that puppet king didn't work out very well, so he makes a different man king. His uncle becomes the king, and this man, he changed his name to Zedekiah. This was the man that we described to you last week, the last king of Judah. That was the period then known as the captivity. Zedekiah was an evil king. He ruled for 9 years. After 9 years, he also rebelled against Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar has finally had enough of these rebellions. And so he returns to the Jerusalem for a third siege. This one lasted for 2 years. And in the year 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. He destroyed the city. He destroyed all of the buildings. He burnt them with fire. He destroyed all of the infrastructure. He toppled every means that the nation would have to rebuild themselves and every means that the city would have for ever resisting again. This period of time was known as the desolation because of the desolate city, because of the desolate condition that the nation was left in. That remained for 70 years as the prophet Jeremiah spoke. Again, predicted in Jeremiah 25, verse 11. Most scholars will tell you that that period of time began the time of the Gentiles. It began in 606 BC when Nebuchadnezzar becomes the king because he established the first worldwide empire that was not under Jewish rule. It was under Gentile rule. But that brings us to this interesting 3 young men. The 3 Hebrew, we often call them children. I prefer to call them captives. They were young men. They were probably not children. We meet here Daniel. Daniel and his 3 friends that we often, or should I say too often in Sunday school, refer to them by their captive Babylonian names. Their Hebrew names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we really should endeavor to know their Hebrew names more so than their Gentile, Babylonian, Aramaic names. Turn with me quickly to Isaiah 39. I find this so interesting. We're going to go to some cross references. Isaiah 39 also predicts this. Isaiah chapter 39. When we read the first several verses that Daniel says the king tells this man Ashpenaz of his eunuchs to find children in whom is no blemish, but they're well favored and they're skillful in wisdom and they're understanding science, and he wants to teach them that the king appoints them these daily provision and meat. Notice in Isaiah chapter 39, verse 5, then said Isaiah to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days come. This is over 100 years before these events occur. Behold, the days come that all that is in thine house and that which thy fathers have laid up in store until this day shall be carried to, he tells them the place, to Babylon. Nothing shall be left. That's desolate, right? Saith the Lord. And of thy sons, children of the king, and of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Predicted over 100 years before it happens. Daniel or Isaiah says not only are there some men that are going to go be eunuchs in Babylon, but he says they're going to be descendants of the king. Well, that's exactly what we see here. These 4 Hebrew captives were descendants of good King Hezekiah. They're of the nobility. And so they're carried away into Babylon and they're made eunuchs and they're turned over to this man named Ashpenaz, who is the king or the prince of the eunuchs. And I find it interesting that he changes their names, just like they changed Zedekiah's name. From his previous Hebrew name, they give him this new name. They change their names, and this is done in order to separate them from their Hebrew religion. He's trying to separate them from their Hebrew customs. And he has the supervision over them. Make no mistake here, when it says that, they were to give them 3 years of teaching. This 3 years course is to teach them the ways of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are very learned. I mean, we remember the Chaldeans that we were introduced to in our study of Hezekiah or Habakkuk. The Chaldeans are technologically advanced. They're full of wisdom. They are the wise men of the day. And this 3-year course is to change these Jewish young men into Babylonian young men. It's to teach him the way and the wisdom and the traditions of Babylon. It's brainwashing. I mean, that's what we would call it today, right? No, it's an indoctrination center. It's the university of the day, isn't it? That's the, dare I say, public education camp of ancient Babylonia. It's to teach them the way of the government, the way of the king. And the first thing they do here is they change the names. They change the name of Daniel in verse number 7 to Belteshazzar. Daniel means God is my judge. Belteshazzar means Bel will protect my life, a god of Babylon. The man Hananiah, they changed to Shadrach. Hananiah means the Lord show me grace. Shadrach means under the command of Aku, which is the Babylonian moon god. Mishael, they changed to Meshach. Mishael in Hebrew means who is like our God. Meshach, who is like Aku, which is, again, this pagan god of the moon in Babylon. Azariah, they changed to Abednego. Azariah means the Lord is my help in Hebrew. Abednego is the servant of Nego, which is another false god of Babylon. And so we see them changing these names. And again, it's an attempt to separate them from their teaching. It's a separation from their traditions and from their Hebrew roots. And here comes the test of loyalty. This test concerns their loyalty and their faithfulness to God. You see, the king in verse 5 appointed them daily provision of the king's meat and of the king's drink. And he was going to nourish them for 3 years. And at the end of that 3 years, they would stand before the king and give an account of everything they learned. And then verse number 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. You see, they're supposed to be given this food and this drink of the Chaldean scholars. I understand that this is not mere subsistence. This is a full ride scholarship. This is free education. I said I wasn't going to get political, but this Bible is up to date, isn't it? I mean, this Bible, this is accurate. This is where we live. Just so hard. This is free education, and this isn't just free education at your public university. This is free education at the Ivy League schools, all paid for by the government. Oh, by the way, it comes with free room and board, and you're not eating, bread and water here. This is not prison sentence. This is the king's provision. Anything you want, everything you want, as much as you want. Food from the king's table, which is, by the way, forbidden by the Jewish law for a couple of reasons. The Babylonian kings would eat meat. First of all, meat that would not be drained of its blood. They would eat meat with the blood still in it, which was forbidden for the Jews. But they would also eat meat that had been offered to all of these idols, these false gods that they named these young men after. They would rinse it with wine, not wine that was preserved for the offering and the sacrifice in the temple, but wine that was, as we will see later when we get into the book of Daniel, it was wine that was often used for drunken parties, which we'll see that's exactly how Persia conquers them. If you study the Babylonian culture, you find that one of their very favorite meats was pork. Also forbidden for Jews. I mean, there's just so many ways in which this is wrong, right? And so these young men, these 4 young men, and I believe Daniel is probably Daniel's probably their leader, if you will. He's their cheerleader. He's their spokesman. He's the outspoken one. Which, by the way, we'll see him separated from them. You have to learn to, in a couple of chapters, you're going to see 3 of them that have to stand without their leader at some point. That's a lesson to learn. These young men that there's no way they're 20 years old. They're probably, between 15 and 18. Most folks think 16 or 17. It's so fascinating to me how they act, because while most young men would probably congratulate themselves on a full ride scholarship to the elite university with all room and board paid for and they can choose whatever, these men did not consider that to be an honor. And they could have made all sorts of excuses as to, we must comply. The government mandates it. The king said we had to. I mean, I have to put on my mask. It's there. It's just so easy to make these applications, isn't it? I mean, the king says we have to. The king says we must. The government says we can't. We have to comply. We have to do this. We can't do that. But when God's law says we must obey God rather than men, that's what this comes to. This comes to 3 young men that says we obey God rather than men. And so they could have made all sorts of excuses. After all, they're being blessed beyond measure. But it comes at a price because they're captives. Remember when we read Psalm 134, they're captives in a weary land. They're promoted, but they're captives. Refusal could cost them advancement. Refusal could have them singled out. Refusal could actually get them killed, which you'll see in a few chapters. And so they had all sorts of reasons that they could have made excuses why they simply must comply. And surely the Lord will overlook a little sin. Surely the Lord will overlook a small step when it's mandated by the government. The key here is in verse number 8, where this young man named Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. And the lesson here for us is that the decision must be made before the trial. And you've probably had this in a dozen different training classes which you've had. I've had this concept given to me in numerous trainings that I've taken. If you wait till the moment of crisis to make a decision, you'll freeze. If you wait till the moment of crisis, perhaps your life is in danger or the life of one of your loved ones is in danger. And if you wait for the moment of crisis to think about the decision, you'll freeze and that decision time will pass you by and you won't be making the decision. Somebody else will be making that decision for you. The time to make a critical decision is before you're placed into the situation. And Daniel purposed in his heart, which means his decision was made before the situation ever presented itself. The decision has to be made before the trial comes. Young person, you'll be faced with drugs. You'll be faced with alcohol. You'll be faced with temptations that we won't discuss in mixed company. And if you wait until that temptation comes, you'll fall. You make that decision now. Because this young man made that decision now. He wasn't going to drink the king's wine. He wasn't going to eat the king's meat. He wasn't going to go down the road of sin. The decision was made before the opportunity came. Don't wait for the opportunity before you make the decision. Make the decision before the opportunity presents itself. And I can say that in a dozen different ways. Here's what else he does. Verse number 9, God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Do you know that Proverbs 16 verse 7 says that when you obey the Lord, even your enemies will be at peace with you? There's an example right there. Even your enemies can be at peace with you. And here's how this situation works out. Daniel doesn't act like a bunch of us. He doesn't stomp his foot, raise his voice, wave his flags, storm the Capitol. See, I said I wasn't going to get political, didn't I? It's just so easy. But that's how we act, isn't it? I'm going to obey God, I'm not going to obey man, and I'm going to make everybody else know about it. Because I want everybody to know how righteous I am. I want everybody to know I'm going to obey. Because I want to drum up a little support, and I want to get a little crowd around here, right? And that way, just, if he does come after me and it does cost me, we're going to have some backup here. But what Daniel does here is he does not become self-righteous. He doesn't make an assault on the Chaldean region. He doesn't go out and say, well, listen, let me tell you why you're wrong, because my God says this, and my God says that, and my God says that your God's wrong, and he just doesn't enter the debate. It's not time for a theological debate. He just says, listen, let's just try this out. He doesn't stomp his foot and raise a ruckus. He doesn't go get his union steward and say, I'm not doing it and you can't make me. I'm going to get off on this road yet, ain't I? He doesn't just outright refuse. He doesn't get contempt. He doesn't show his contempt for their religion. He doesn't show his contempt for this man named Melzar that the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in verse number 11. He just voluntarily says, let's have a test. Let's have an experiment. We can prove this with a test. And so Daniel risks his life. He risks his reputation to put God to the test. Not because he questioned God, but that he wanted to prove his own faith. Look at verse 11. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants. I beseech thee, 10 days, let them give us pulse to eat, that's vegetables, and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenances of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. You see, he doesn't get into this theological debate. He doesn't tell them how wrong they are. He doesn't get out and say, well, let me prove it to you. He doesn't wave his flag and storm the hill. He just says, listen, you know what? You might not understand this, but let's just have an experiment. You just prove this. You make it as hard on me as you want. You just give me vegetables and water and see if we can't keep up. If I can keep up with everybody else with this program, will you let us keep this program? Just see if I can keep up with everybody else. And you know what? God says, hey, those guys right there, they're going to be better than everybody else because they're going to obey me. That's how it worked out. They didn't question God. They just put their faith to the test. But they didn't take this action for personal gain. See, they're going to be living in captivity for at least 70 years. And they know that if they're going to be there for 70 years, again, we mentioned that last week, if you're going there for 70 years, when you're setting up, it's not time to compromise, because now your children are going to compromise and your grandchildren are going to compromise. And if you compromise now, you're going to be compromising forever. Here's the issue. Here's the application for us. Romans chapter number 12. Verse number 2 says, be not conformed to this world, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That's what those 4 Hebrew young men did. They weren't conformed to all the young men around them. They were transformed because they had better thoughts and they were more wise than everybody else around them. Daniel, in verse number 8, had made the decision beforehand. He says, I'm not going down that road of compromise. I'm going to stand on God's word. Transformed, not conformed to everybody else around. He was transformed, and the transformation made him trusting. You're there in Romans chapter 12. Look at verse. I wrote the wrong one down. 18. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. They were trusting. They didn't attack Melzar. They didn't attack Ashpenaz. They didn't attack Melzar. They're just the king's messengers. They're just pagans in a pagan land worshiping a pagan god. You know what they did? They were trusting in their God and lived a life of an example before them. And so they received this 3 years training. As for these 4 children in verse 17, God gave them knowledge and skill and learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The king communed with them, and among them was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. They were trained. Not only did they pass the test for 10 days, they completed the whole 3 years. They completed the entire 3-year course. They were brought before the king. When the king quizzed them, that's what that word commune there means. When the king quizzed them, he says, these 4 men have wisdom 10 times better than any of my wise men, than any of their peers. These men have, we would say today, wisdom beyond their years. You know why? They had the Holy Spirit. They knew the Lord. They had the Holy Spirit. So they were transformed, they were trusting, they were trained, and finally they were triumphant. Look at verse 21. Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. We don't have time for the rest of the history lesson, but just let me give you the end of the book at the beginning of the book. Daniel actually continues past the first year of King Cyrus. He continues to the 3rd year of King Cyrus. You know what that means? All 70 years of the captivity, Daniel lived it. Daniel didn't just come as a prisoner, as a young man, as a 16, 17-year-old refugee from Judah and die in a foreign land. He came to Babylon, and he lived the entire 70-year captivity period from the beginning unto the end. He saw the captives go home. That's what that means. A faithful man that stood up to the first king that tried to put them under tribute and make them refuse to obey the laws of their God. He said, no, we'll obey God rather than men. And God honored him, and he saw the men go home. That's important. Don't miss it. Because God doesn't say that that's going to happen for every one of us, but God does say he will bless us for obedience. We may not see the end of the captivity, but he will bless us for obedience. This reminds me, this is one of the reasons why I think it's important that we study the captivity right after we study the prophecies concerning the captivity. What was it that Habakkuk with 3 Ks prayed for? In wrath, remember mercy. In wrath, God remembered mercy because we know of at least 4 men that stood up, and one of them that lived through the entire captivity period, and he watched the men go home. And not only did God remember mercy, but God was faithful, and they didn't end their nationality in Babylon. He sent them back to Judah. Don't miss that we have not only a God of judgment in Habakkuk, but we had a God of faithfulness in the book of Daniel that we see demonstrated right here in the first chapter. And I'll say the same thing that I said last week. The chosen people were living like pagans in the chosen land. God will take his holy people and send them to a pagan land to make them live holy lives. He'd rather have a few holy men in an unrighteous pagan land living for him than he will have a whole bunch of pagans living in the Holy Land. I know I said I'm not going to get political, but the parallels are obvious, aren't they? In wrath, remember mercy, but remember God is faithful. He's faithful to his people today because we serve the same God who hasn't changed. He's immutable. He's the same yesterday and today, and he'll be the same forever. And it doesn't matter how crazy our country gets. It was pretty crazy in Judah for about 30 years. And look at the testimony that they left for us. Because 4 men, led by Daniel, purposed in their heart that they would not defile themselves with the rules of the king. I hope you draw encouragement from that. I hope you draw strength from that. It was a challenge for me to remember that these 4 young men were transformed and trusting and trained, but ultimately, because of God's faithfulness, they were triumphant. Let's stand, Brother Derek, if you would come. We'll have a song. If I can help you, pray with you.
Turn over to 261.